So Frank not only has one of the coolest job titles that I've heard, VP of Intelligence, but he leads Medical Alley Starts, which is an initiative to lower the cost of starting, scaling, and pivoting new ventures in Medical Alley, which is a global epicenter of health innovation and care located in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, where Prince is also from, and I believe that they have the best apples in the world. And the Mayo Clinic is also there, but I'm sure Frank will tell you more about that. In addition to that initiative, Frank leads Medical Alley Global, which works to support international business entry into the largest healthcare market, the United States. And with that, I will pass over to our speaker today. So Frank, as you can see, we're recording this session. This is for today. Please feel free to share your screen when you're ready. And in terms of how you'd like to manage questions, that's up to you. You can take questions at the end or throughout the chat. Beste and I will keep an eye on the chat for you.
Fantastic. I appreciate it. It's really good to be here with you all today. It actually makes me feel very good, the Prince and Apple reference, because that must mean the presentation worked because you remembered it like a year later. I'm going to steal the hype song idea for our events. It's just a nice way to break up the monotony of like we've all been doing 1,000 Zooms. So Frank Gestalti, Medical Alley Association, you got the quick intro. What I'm going to talk about today is some of my experiences, Medical Alley's experiences working with startups from the US and from around the world, many of which are from Australia, on entering the US market and some of the really common challenges that we've seen. I'm going to share my screen now, and as I'm going through the presentation, please do at any point, feel free to stop me, ask a question, whatever you might have. With the way the screen displays, probably just best like yell it out because I may not immediately see you on the strip of people that it will show while I'm presenting. The biggest caveat in all of it, though, is to know I don't do the work you do. I work with a lot of people that do the work you do, and I try to learn from them and then reflect back the observations. And so everything I'm going to talk about is based on seeing hundreds and hundreds of companies like yours, similar to yours, not like yours, and the struggles that they've gone through and the things that have worked for them. As was mentioned, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about where I'm coming from. As was mentioned, it's the home of Prince, one of the most famous rock and roll artists in the world. He grew up down the street from where I am right now. He lived his entire life here. He was a fan of saying when people had asked him, why don't you move to LA or somewhere? And he was like, I just like it, which is a truly Minnesotan answer. We do have the best apple on earth. I cannot bring them to Australia because Australia is very strict about bringing farm goods in from outside the country, as they should be. But if you get up here at some point, you gotta eat it. It is like crazy good if you haven't had one before. It's like not an apple you've had. The other piece is Mall of America. Not as relevant right now with like we're not going to these sorts of places, but pre-pandemic, single most visited place in the United States of America. More than Times Square, the Statue of Liberty, the Grand Canyon, Golden Gate Bridge was the Mall of America. People from around the world would fly in, go shopping, go home. I don't pretend to understand it. It is a good mall. But if you were going to come to Minnesota, like of all the things you could see, this should be like way, way down on your list. But there you go. The other part of it, though, is we have this huge healthcare community. We like to argue it's the most innovative health technology cluster in the world. I think I'll demonstrate for you in a second like why we think that, and it's credible, which is we're home to Mayo Clinic, #1 hospital in the US. We're home to a little company called United Health Group, the largest health insurer in the world. They're a $280 billion behemoth, and their annual growth rate is the equivalent of an entire Medtronic every year and then some. And we have 15,000 other healthcare companies in a state that has the population of about 5.5 million people. Physically a very large state, but population-wise not all that large. but we do healthcare and we do it really well. 500,000 people work in the sector, in delivery and payment and technology. But what you're really interested in is how you might become one of those companies, whether in Minnesota or somewhere else, but that you could bring your innovation to this market for fun, for profit, to improve healthcare. And I think especially with this cohort of companies, I'd probably put more emphasis on the fun and on the social impact and positive impact that your products might make in the world. As I said, my caveat of I don't do this, but I worked with tons of companies that do and that see observations from it. I always appreciate hearing from the entrepreneurs when, as I share these things, your reflections of if you've had the same challenges, maybe you've responded to them differently, you have new approaches. That helps me to learn. And then for the next group of companies that I get to interact with, I can bring your knowledge to them and help pay it forward. This is what I'm going to go through. These are kind of the most common mistakes that I see companies make when they're entering the US healthcare market. I'm going to talk about each challenge and then some of the things you might do to avoid or to overcome that challenge. The first and the single most important and single most common one I see is failure to validate that there's actually a market in the US. Because your product works, because it is commercially successful somewhere, does not mean that product will work or be successful in the US market. For a whole host of reasons, we do healthcare differently than everywhere else, on every level you can imagine. And so if you don't come in and validate that your product has a real market in the US, there's a very high probability that you will find out either that there's not a market or that there is a smaller market than you thought, and you can't build a big enough business to cover the fixed costs of simply existing in the US. So what can you do? First of all, you can get help. There are people who do this. There are serial entrepreneurs, executives, consultants who that's what they do is they do market research, they do market validation. To be fair, it is a thing US startups get wrong all the time, especially technical founders who have really deep domain knowledge in an area. If it's a doctor, a scientist, they know their area and they develop a solution to a problem they have, but they may not recognize that others don't have that problem, or it's just not as important of a problem, one they don't really care if they fix. So you should go out and test your assumptions with your target customer, which means if the US is a target, you need to talk to US potential customers and get their feedback, their reactions, and find out not just is it a problem, but is it a big enough problem that they would actually do something about it? You need to test it in multiple settings. So people might want to go to Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Cleveland Clinic. Those health systems are not representative of the majority of healthcare in the US. Those are top-level academic medical centers that serve a relatively small portion of the patient population. If that's not your customer base, their feedback is going to be the opposite of helpful. And then, of course, like everything in entrepreneurship, be willing to change and pivot. No plan survives first contact with the customer. Adaptation is the name of the game, but you all know that one. The second most common one that I see is discounting the cost of change. So you may have a product that has a market, it would be a real improvement, it would be meaningful, but you've got to get someone to change what they might have been doing for a very long time. Change is hard. If you've ever tried to pick up a new habit, you've ever tried to quit smoking, start exercising more, you get this. Change is hard. Now imagine you're a surgeon who has done a surgery the same way for 25 years, and you want them to do it a different way. Or you're a hospital administrator and you've billed for something in a certain way. Or you're a patient that the way you've treated your condition is by taking a certain pill. Change is hard, and I guarantee you, no matter how hard you think it is, double it and double it again. That's how much harder it will be in the real world, how much longer it will take, and how much more costly it will be than you anticipate. Because often what happens is we're talking with the people who are most motivated by our innovation, the early adopters, they love it. They'll do something only because it's new. If you haven't read Crossing the Chasm, I can't recommend it enough. It is a great marketing book on this very topic. You get past those early adopters, and the rest of the population doesn't act like that. So what do? Well, you got to work on big problems with big impact. Change has to be worth it. Or find a niche area, something small enough that you can really focus on driving a behavior change. Another great marketer, Seth Godin, likes to talk about smallest viable audience, because if you can get them on board, that builds momentum to then get others on board. And then understand what truly and actually matters to your stakeholders. It may not be the thing you think it is. The problem that you're solving may be a problem, but may not be the biggest problem they have in that area. And you may gain an insight that allows you to adapt and solve an even more important problem to that patient or doc or whoever, and accelerate your market development. This one's kind of a counterintuitive one for a lot of people who haven't operated in the US healthcare market before. So if you come in and you say, we're going to save money, that actually doesn't help you as much as you might think. So first of all, savings is someone's revenue. So you're now tanking someone else's business. Are they going to be a barrier to your adoption? Saving matters, but whose money do you save and who pays for it? So if you save the hospital money, the hospital may like it, but the one paying for the product may be a health insurance company, and they may not see the benefit of that cost savings. Just because someone saves money doesn't mean they go and lower the price. So you may save one person, but not the person who actually needs the savings to be motivated to drive your product forward. The other part, which should be super obvious, but I say it because I'm amazed at how many times it's not, you actually got to prove you really do save money in the US, in the real world, in your specific setting. Just because it makes sense, you get people out of the hospital faster, they're healed quicker, or they avoid downstream treatment because of your product, doesn't mean you actually have saved any money or will save any money, or that you'll save money for someone who cares. An area where we see this fail a lot is a company will, this will save money downstream. Patient will be healthier, so 5 years later, their healthcare costs will be lower. On average in the US, people switch their health insurer every 2 years. So if a savings takes 5 years to pay out, no one cares. Because the health insurance company that's paying for it doesn't get the savings. Their competitor gets the savings for free. So what can you do? You really need to understand the value proposition. If you're saving money, where is it saved from? Who is it saved from? Might you create new revenue opportunities in doing this? Maybe you free up resources that can be redeployed into a new high growth area for the provider or the payer. Or maybe by helping the patient in this area, it opens up other opportunities to provide care to the patient. Understand the stakeholders' motivations. It may not be money. For a lot of clinicians, they're probably more interested in, does it help my patient? Does it make my practice easier? Do I get prestige from being the first to adopt it? The payers, they're going to really care about cost savings because they're literally paying for it, but they're going to care about their cost savings, which is in that 2-year window. For the patients, it might be out-of-pocket costs. So a lot of healthcare is paid out-of-pocket in the US. You have co-pays and co-insurance. Maybe you have a lower cost product, so my copay or my co-insurance is less, and so I'm going to pick your product over a competitor product because I just save money. Or maybe you get me back to health faster. I have an injury, you help me recover quicker, so I'm back to doing the things I enjoy quicker. I might actually pay a premium for that access, for that convenience. The next one, again, this is obvious, and Americans do this all the time when they go into other countries, but it's assuming that our system operates like yours. We have an incredibly complex and very large healthcare system that has a public setup for the elderly, which, to make it even more confusing, is called Medicare, which I know there's a Medicare in Australia, but it is a very different thing. We then have Medicaid, which is for the indigent and the poor. Most private insurance, or commercial insurance as it's called, comes through employers. So I get my health insurance through my job. The payments then are a mix of me, my employer, the insurer, and the government. And then there's still a very significant portion of the population that either does not have insurance or does not have sufficient insurance to cover some of the care they might need. And as a result, out of pocket costs and medical debt can be quite significant. So, what can you do? Well, again, it comes back to understanding the market. What care provider might be using your product? What kind of patient? What sort of insurance would they likely have? And then you need to build the algorithm for your product and for your business that solves for that patient with that payer and that provider environment. So if I'm developing a surgical device, maybe it speeds up procedures. My docs are going to like it because they could do more surgeries in a day. The payer's going to like it because I can move it from a hospital to an ambulatory surgical center, which has lower reimbursement, so I pay less. The patient's going to like it because I pay less at an ASC, and because the docs do such high volume, the recovery times tend to be quicker. That's going to be different from if you were doing a new drug, a breakthrough device, or a digital health product where you have a completely different market. But if you don't solve for all parts of that health system and how does it create value for them, you're going to get stuck and not see adoption. The next one that I see is the classic platform technology. Let me tell you, no one buys a platform technology. That's just not a thing. They buy a solution to a problem that they care about. Now, you may have a platform that allows you to build a solution for a problem they care about, but when you come into the US market, you need to organize your company around that specific solution. If you're going an FDA route, FDA regulates products not on the product, but on its intended use. I could have one product that has multiple intended uses and indications for use, even if it's the same product. In reimbursement, they pay for a specific procedure or disease or treatment. No one pays for the platform. What they're buying is a solution to their problem. Same thing if you're doing a health IT product. I want to buy a product that reduces my pain, that solves for my mental health conditions. Platforms are great for research, they don't make for a business. So what do? You've got to pick a launch market. What are you going to market with? What are you going to develop sufficiently to turn into a commercial product? How you assess and determine which one to pick, that's up to you. That's part of the strategy. You might be looking at the size of the market or their growth rates or their profitability. You might be looking for tailwinds that make the market easier. You might be looking for a market that has limited competition. You might be looking for a market that has a lot of competition, but you have a highly differentiated product that can break through. But you have to pick something. It's almost better to pick wrong than it is to just not pick and come with a platform, because at least if you pick wrong, you're going to be able to go forward with a hypothesis, test it, learn, and then refine for the next round. Insufficient capital, I don't think will be surprising. This is usually the first thing startups bring up. It's not the first problem they usually have. Most companies that have insufficient capital first have a problem of insufficient market identification and validation, and then haven't developed the appropriate go-to-market strategy to justify getting the capital that they need. But here's the thing, the US market is expensive. Physically, we're a really large country, and this is something I know Australians understand. It is far to go from New York to LA. I can fly from Minneapolis to London faster than people can fly from New York to LA. It's complex, multiple stakeholders, public and private. And it's a giant market. $4 trillion are spent on healthcare in the United States every year, and that's growing about 3 to 5% a year. We're adding every year the GDP of a small country in healthcare spend. So you have this big giant market physically and financially that's very complex. What does that mean? You need a lot of money to address it. And I'd actually say I see a lot of companies that they could raise more and they think it's a better idea to just raise a little bit and then go raise more later. And they run into big problems because they run out of money before they hit an inflection point to raise more money, to raise enough money to actually grow. So what can you do? Well, of course, raise money. Wouldn't we all like that? But that might not be the right strategy for your business, or you might not have a venture backable company. Venture capital is 1% of financing of small businesses in the United States. Most companies are not going to raise venture capital ever. Most companies that try to raise venture capital fail to raise it. So there's other things you can do. One of the most common ones, even by companies that plan to become very large, multi-billion-dollar companies, they often start with what's called a limited market release. They narrow their target and they don't launch in the US. They launch in part of the US. So they pick maybe even one hospital, hire one sales rep, and develop right there. They start generating sales. They learn, because no matter what your plan is, it's wrong. That's just the nature of business. So you go and do it, you learn, you iterate, you hire a second rep with the revenue you're generating, learn more, a third, a fourth, and before you know it, you're hiring 5 reps at a time, 10 reps at a time, and you get the scale. But I see this all the time, even with companies that raise tens of millions of venture capital. They'll put one rep at one site and grow from there, because that way, if there is a mistake, you make a mistake in one customer, not with 500 customers.
Hey, Frank. Sorry, just
Yes.
a quick question. When it comes to hiring the sales reps, is that just to clarify and validate your go-to-market approach and strategy?
I mean, partly yes, right? So you're gonna develop a go-to-market strategy, and then eventually you got to go test it. You got to actually do it and see if it works. So bringing on the sales rep is one way of doing that, right? I mean, that's as real as it gets to go out and sell product and see what comes back. Depending on the kind of market you're in, if you're selling a device, you're probably going to go hire a professional sales rep right out of the gate. If you're in more of an enterprise digital health product, you as the CEO may be doing that initial sales, where you're going to be learning a lot about the inner workings of the company and that sort of thing before bringing on a sales rep to scale it up. And if it's in pharma, you got a whole different thing. Pharma sales is just a weird thing in the US, because pharma sales aren't really sales, because you can't make the doc actually write the script. You just can educate them, and the doc writes a script or doesn't. But so yes, it is one part of like testing and proving your strategy.
Right. Well, what about pharma manufacturing? Because that's sort of the process that we're targeting. Sorry, should have introduced myself
if
first.
you're selling, if your customer is pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, mainly the contracting drug manufacturers.
Yep. So then in that case, yeah, I would probably go get a sales rep. There's a whole industry of CDMOs and contract manufacturing. So you could probably find a person who has done that kind of work and thus would have a network of your prospective customers. That's one of the values in bringing on a rep. It's not just they know how to sell, but they have people they can call up who trust them that can help you make those first set of sales.
Thanks so much.
Yep. Yeah, right on. Next one we see, primarily if, of course, you're in a regulated product, device, or drug, we see quite often an overemphasis on FDA and a discounting of reimbursement. Historically, this made sense. FDA used to be really hard. Reimbursement was relatively easy. It's flipped. Reimbursement can be nightmarish. It is a gating function. It is Your company exists, your company doesn't. And on the other side of it, the FDA has become a lot more manageable. Their processes are a lot better today. So if you have an FDA regulated product, not that it's ever easy, but it is way more manageable. The thing that ends up happening is companies end up not looking at reimbursement until it's too late. And so much of what you do in regulatory, clinical, and product development is going to determine your reimbursement strategy that if you don't figure this out early, you get locked in to your reimbursement. We have a Canadian company we've been working with. They came to the US, they got a 510K, then they called up and they said, we want to look at reimbursement. It's like, well, I have bad news. Your predicate device for your 510K probably has reimbursement. To some degree, that's your reimbursement now. And you better hope that is sufficient to build your business, because if it's not, you have to go and start over, like a new FDA submission, new product, like go back to the starting point and go all the way through. So what can you do? Right up there with market validation. If your product is going to need reimbursement, figure this out before you do anything. Seriously, like as early as you can, you need to understand what you're going to need to do, because it'll impact how much money you'll need to raise, what kind of product you would develop, the sort of studies you might do, the way you sell it, who you sell it to. This is one of those things that, like, if you don't know it and it matters, stop and figure it out before you spend another penny, because you may be wasting it in the wrong direction. Next one then is the distribution over product. We see tons and tons where people are really investing. I gotta make this product better. One more feature. Let's make it great. That's wonderful. Eventually you gotta get out and sell. You gotta prove that someone actually wants to use the product in a way that makes your business model, whether it's for-profit, non-profit, whatever it is, sustainable and viable. Because if you're not sustainable, you can't help the patients. And here's the thing. Sales is really, really expensive. A good medical device sales rep in the United States, if they're hitting target, should make $250,000 plus per year. If you're a med device company, usually your single largest expense is your sales reps. But you kind of want that, because if they're making money, that means they're selling your product. That means they're doing their job. The more money they make, the more the company is make. People joke and say sales reps are coin operated. It's also expensive though, because reaching customers is hard. If doctors are your customers, they're incredibly hard to reach. They're busy. They've probably seen what you're doing before. You're going to have to get certified by the hospital before you can physically walk on the campus to sell your product. You're then going to have to try to get a meeting, and they might not even have time. They might give you 5 minutes if you're lucky. If you're selling enterprise software, maybe you're selling to employers. That's the more common strategy today. Those HR departments, their phone is ringing off the hook from your competitors and people doing all kinds of other things, all trying to get their attention. It is hard, it is expensive, it is complex. People are successful at it all the time when they do it right. But it's expensive. So if you're not planning for that up front, you're going to run into problems. So that goes right back to the beginning. Do that market assessment before FDA, if that applies to your product. Figure out the reimbursement side of things and put together a strategy that says, here's the world I want to live in. In order to create that world, I need to do A, B, and C, which costs 1, 2, 3. And we can work backwards from it. Do that narrow market, right? Don't put all of your chips down on doing a big national launch, and if it goes wrong, you're done. Be capital efficient about it, right? Like, make small, efficient bets in what you're doing. And that includes, when you get to the US, how you operate. I'm obviously biased about coming to Minnesota about this. But in all honesty, if you set up in San Francisco as one of these companies, unless you have tens of millions of dollars, you're wasting your time. Go to LA if you really want to be in California. It's half the cost. You will spend your money on a bunch of things that do not advance your business, namely the office space, as opposed to putting your money into proving you have a business, and then you can expand. The other part is thinking about your operations and your commercial team. Sales forces are remote. Like well before the pandemic, they were operating work from home, remote in the field. That's how they lived. Where you get customers is not necessarily where you're going to find suppliers or your M&A exit or any of your other resources. I always pick on Houston because people love the Texas Medical Center. You can make a ton of money at the Texas Medical Center. We have some members that are very large companies that get 10 to 15% of their revenue there. None of them have any of their operations there because you can't find anything but doctors in Texas or in Houston. If you needed an engineer or a medical marketer or a clinical research professional, you know what you're going to do? You're going to put your money on a FedEx truck. That money's going to drive north up I-35 to Minneapolis, and it's going to give the money to one of my members. We will gladly take that money, but it'd be a lot easier if you just said, oh, I'll just be there, or I'll be in Boston, or I'll be in Orange County. If you're in healthcare, go to where the healthcare companies are, because then you find talent and you find peers, and it's a lot cheaper. And that is the presentation. I'll stop talking at you and say thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please do ask them. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment because it's easier to see y'all.
Thank you so much, Frank. Before we open the floor to questions, please join me in a round of applause for Frank. I've heard this presentation now a couple of times and I still walk away learning something new. So thank you for that. Maybe I'll kick off with a question while everyone else gathers their thoughts. And actually, I forgot to mention that Frank, where I met Frank, was actually here in Sydney in February of last year. And it was probably the last real life event I went to for work before, the world changed a little bit. So he's stuck in my mind for that reason as well, in a good way. So Frank, I know that you talked a little bit about, coming into the US and really leaving assumptions behind in terms of how the market works and how it is so different. Do you have any examples of how you have seen international startups, whether they're Australian or not, be tripped up by that? Whether it is, are there sort of some lessons to be learned from the way that private health insurance works in the US, or are there, I suppose any sort of lessons or failings that you've seen a few times that retells?
Yep. I won't name names of companies, but one I've seen a couple of times, including with an Australian company that is right now in the process of rebooting, like rehiring a whole team, relates to the insurance side. So connected health product, they were pursuing reimbursement, and what they didn't account for is that because health insurance in the US, there are so many different insurers that the way the savings get calculated and where the value lies can shift from customer to customer and patient to patient. So they had built a business where they had proven, hey, this works in Australia. They were making sales, customers loved it, it created value, clinically it's great. They get to the US, clinically it's as effective, but each payer looked at it in a different way because each payer has a different mix of patients that have different needs. So we see this quite often where companies are kind of dumbfounded that they present the same information to multiple payers that you would think like, oh, these are all commercial payers. These are 4 Blue Cross plans. And they get 4 different answers in response. And a lot of companies get tripped up by that. The second one that I see a lot of times happen is companies will talk about, well, there's a code. Like, that don't matter. Like, what kind of code? And so there's coding and reimbursement, what's called CPT, code of procedural terminology, um, of the most odd thing in the world. It is not a government thing. It is not a standards thing. It is a group of physicians, part of the American Medical Association, who create it. But if you have a code, that just means there's a way to track something has happened. And I had this morning with an international company. Like, we have a code, so we can get reimbursement. I look it up. They have what's called the Category 3 code, which is just a data gathering code. It's where you start. To go from a Cat 3 to a Cat 1 code, which is what you ultimately want, can be like a 3 to 5 year process. And if you have a code, it doesn't mean you have coverage or payment. So once you get a code, then you got to convince the payers to cover whatever is described under that code and get sufficient payment under that coverage policy to make a viable business. So I see this all the time. I even see it with US companies, though, where they're like, we have a code. Like, don't care. That's just a starting point. Doesn't mean you have coverage or payment. You don't have a business. A slightly different one, because I know there's digital health stuff in the mix as well from time to like in that area where like reimbursement isn't as much of a thing. The barrier or the problem I end up seeing the most is two things. One, timelines. Average sales cycle in digital health is 12 to 18 months per customer. Like, companies just run out of cash before they can get paid. And that's just sales cycle. Like, then it'll be another 3 to 6 months to actually get paid. Like, everything in health insurance is like 120 days. Just, it's the way it works. So companies will run out of money before they can actually get the customer to pay. The second issue that they'll run into is they don't know about all the compliance things that are required. Like, get familiar with SOC 2 and high trust. If you don't have that stuff done up front, when the customer asks for it and you tell them, oh, I don't have that done, you're done. But even if they were like, okay, we'll wait for you to get it, it's going to be another couple of months for you to go and do that. And by that time, the CEO of the hospital might have switched, or your executive champion has taken a new job and you're back at square one.
Right. Thank you. It's such a complex system. Just out of interest, as you probably are aware, in countries like, so in places like the UK, people have a health record and the system is quite integrated. So you would change your primary care physician, for example, and your record will follow you. And increasingly, we are more and more like that here. We have an e-health record that is an opt-out initiative where everything is centralized. So in the US, how do medical records follow a patient? Are they attached to social security numbers?
No, so there is in health related, there's no national identification. And there's a whole bunch of like historical political things, like where the whole idea of like national ID is a very like sensitive topic in the US context. For health records, it's still a mess, but the interoperability has been getting better. So like, super practical example, I go to Mayo and I go to my community hospital system. My health records dance back and forth without me doing anything. 2 years ago, that was not the case. I would like redo my medical history, or I would like have to have them call the doc to send a CD-ROM, because of course a CD-ROM, or they would fax paper that would get scanned in optical character recognition, right? It's still an issue in some places, but getting better kind of by the day, where that data goes back and forth. But there's still a lot of legacy data, right? If you have old health records, if you've moved a lot, there's a lot of mess in it, but it's getting better.
Thank you. I thought I would ask, because that sort of integrated care is a relevant point for some of the startups that we have that come through in each cohort. And it makes me laugh that the healthcare sector in other countries is still clinging so much to fax machines. Everyone else has left them behind. Healthcare just loves a fax. Thank you, Frank. Anyone else with questions? And they can be, specific to what you're doing. And as I mentioned in the chat, I did send Frank a summary of what you're all working on, but please feel free to give your 10-second pitch as well.
Sure. Hey, Frank. So I'm co-founder of Symbiote, and we're essentially trying to change the way drug manufacturing happens by making the purification process a lot smoother and more efficient. And so from, I guess, my initial outreach with a couple of CDMOs here, it seems like that CDMO industry is quite resistant to innovation. And I was just wondering if you are familiar with any examples of companies that have created a product or innovative technology and what they did to get that adopted.
Yeah. Are you guys, is your purification in like biologics or in pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, mainly biologics for now.
Biologics, okay. Yep. Yeah, totally get that. If you're trying to change the process of an established drug, right? You don't want to. The amount of work you have to do, unless your product for an existing drug is gonna cut costs by 50%, it's just not worth spending 3 years revalidating. So usually the strategy I see in companies that are working in advanced manufacturing technology for biologics, which I might ask you to send some info after this, because we have a bunch here focused on cell therapy. Usually the strategy is to target startups or researchers and start at that small scale and basically get spec'd in, if you will, so that when the company does get to the point of commercial stage manufacturing, that's the process the CDMO needs to spec in.
Definitely. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Just out of curiosity, what kind of information would you like? Just like a company brief, or?
Yeah, I've got them buried somewhere on my computer, but if I get the fresh email, it'll remind me.
All right, yeah, definitely.
Because there's a group, if you look up, it's called Scale Ready. So it's 3 companies that are working in the space of improving manufacturing process for mainly cell and gene therapies. They're aggressively expanding, acquiring new technology, and especially in biologics, manufacturing is a big part of the total cost of the drug.
Yeah.
So anything that improves the manufacturing, lowers the cost. Unlike pharmaceuticals, it's pill 1 is $1 billion, pill 2 is a penny. Biologics, it's pill 1 is $1 billion, or injection 1, and injection 2 is $100 million. Yeah.
All right, cool. Thanks, Frank. I'll send that over to you ASAP.
Hey Frank, thanks for the talk. My name's Sam. I'm the founder of Neuroflux. We're developing a wearable device for the continuous monitoring of stroke patients. You highlighted the importance of reimbursement, and I've also been advised that recently more in terms of the Australian market. But we're kind of planning on entering the American market at some stage in the future. Just kind of wondering, who do we talk to? Who should we get in touch with to kind of help give us some kind of bit of information around that reimbursement strategy before we enter the US market?
Yeah, there's an entire consulting industry highly specialized in this, and that is you get one of those firms, and what a lot of them will do is they'll have what they call a reimbursement landscape, where it's depending on how complex, it might be $10,000 to $15,000, and they'll go out and assess what does the reimbursement look like today, what's the potential pathways you have to get reimbursement at different levels, and then what would you need to do, clinical studies, regulatory pathway, because they're all integrated in order to get to that. And so basically it gives you a roadmap with a budget to say hey, if you want to go this way, it'll take you X time, Y dollars. If you want to go this way, it's this much. and then you can make decisions about your fundraising and all of that stuff.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. And you mentioned the reimbursement, I mean, the regulatory involved in that as well. So do these consultancy firms, do they do regulatory and reimbursement together, or is it more just?
Increasingly, they're combined. Yes, so there are, historically, it was all very segmented. The trend of the last like 10 years has been a lot of consolidation. So like the two big ones for us here are groups called NAMSA and Covance. Covance is like Covance LabCorp, like the big diagnostic company. And then NAMSA is pure play medical device only group, and they both of them do reg clinical reimbursement quality.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any final questions for Frank before we let him enjoy his dinner? Actually, Frank, one of the teams, they weren't able to join today. They were working, of course. So what they're working on, their target market is plastic surgery or cosmetic surgery as well, and then eventually surgery more generally, elective surgery more generally, but beginning with plastic surgery. So if they were here today, being that the US is, I'm confident in saying the largest cosmetic surgery market in the world, where would a startup like that start?
Yep, Orange County, California. So Orange County, California is, if you're doing aesthetics or ophthalmology, capital of the world. Orange County is like Allergan, so Botox and all of that fun is there, and a bunch of other companies. Plus, Orange County is just beautiful. Like, I mean, it's worst places in the world you could go to hang out. But they have a big device industry, a big pharma industry, big digital health industry, a lot of it around aesthetics. And then you just go north about an hour into LA and you probably have a lot of your customers.
Yeah. I love because it was the first Real Housewives franchise. So that's
Yep.
very, very on brand as well for the cosmetics industry.
That one might have been the most accurate of the shows, in all honesty. And if they are looking at that, I have a longtime friend of the association who used to run reimbursement and policy for Allergan, who's now independent. Kind of, he was part of when they sold for whatever $70 billion. So he's now just kind of doing whatever he wants. But a lot of it is working with small companies in the aesthetic space.
Fantastic, thank you. That's very good to know, and I will pass on the feedback to them. Vinesh had left a comment in the chat, which I think is actually quite. Vinesh, did you have a question around that? So Vinesh mentioned that this session would be valuable for investors to understand long-term strategies. Vinesh, do you mean specifically Australian investors who?
No, I think there's a marked difference between investors who VCs and other investors who understand the medical space and the pace and the money required. Like you did mention, this is something that's there. You need to strategize first before acting fast, and that's more important in our space. And we see I've had a lot of conversations where there's been questions about, hey, why don't you just try an experiment and then figure it out later as you go along. And that works in the normal, smaller kind of spaces, but not in ours. And this session kind of like brings it all into like a very, I can understand why Vesna has been talking about this session a lot, because Frank is very valuable, but it itemizes all the things we actually do and have to look into. So it's good.
I appreciate that. And I agree with you. There, investors who do not come out of the healthcare space, it can be challenging, right? Because they don't get, why do you have to spend all of this money on doing this thing? It also can be very difficult for a company if you do raise money from, not in a pejorative sense, but non-sophisticated investors in this area. If you then try to go raise money from the sophisticated investors, they don't want to deal with that crap. They don't want to have to clean up your cap table, right? Like, there are all these problems that can come up we talked with a lot of angel investors or a lot of tech investors that are like, ooh, healthcare is a big giant market. We'd like to get into that. We're like, cool, we love money, but you should know, these things that you think don't make sense. Here's why it makes sense that like, no, we're not just going to put it on an iPhone and like let our kids start using it to manage their diabetes. Like, you got to test that stuff because you might kill someone. Angry Birds crashes, no one cares. So yeah, right on.
Just a quick follow-up question. Like we are building, Autonomy is an automation platform for enterprise. So what we're trying to do is create that speed of getting regulated assets, so packaging and labeling, to market, automating that process completely. Now, in effect, we are in talks with clients like Bayer, the Bayer Global, and with Novartis and with others, but we're also looking at smaller players. Our thought has been to go through the client network. So it's a multinational company. We go from then prove in one area and then go upwards through there. But the aspect of approaching multiple aspect of approaching smaller companies in this kind of space where they don't necessarily have as big a pain point because of the spread, and the thing is, this can be fixed by putting more people to the task. But the larger organizations, what we've noted is they have got much more risk averseness and cost impact. So would you have any thoughts on that? I think it's quite a broad question to ask, but and I can note that while I'm asking. But yeah, any thoughts on price play?
Yeah, right on. Like, first of all, those are those kind of areas I really like packaging and labeling. So boring, so important though, right? And like, it's not the area that the traditional innovators would be like, I want to fix packaging or the label that goes on the product. But if you're in healthcare, right, you get it. If you mess up the label, you're in not civil issues, but criminal issues, right? And if you're a big company with a lot of products sold in a lot of different markets, little nuances to the labels, and then you need to do a label update, that's a lot of work. So yeah, if you're a small company, you have one product, it's probably just not as big enough a deal to matter yet, right? Like, why automate one thing?
Yeah.
If you're a big company globally, that'd make a lot of sense. The strategy you described on sales, I've seen that from a lot of companies where they get in with like one division, prove it out, and then basically have that division help them sell the other divisions, almost like you're selling other companies, because that's how big, like, they don't know each other, that's how big they are.
Yeah.
But you've now been proven and you're in the vendor system, right? And it's kind of like that limited market release strategy. If you can prove it for real once, you're in a much better position to go prove it again. And I'll tell you, there is a growing interest from the investor community in these areas, like automating and simplifying a lot of the like supply chain tasks in healthcare. I know of ones that are like automating regulatory reviews, automating updating marketing documents. There are compliance reviews. So like a device company, when they go and sell to a hospital, they have to do a security audit. The security audits are the same almost every time. So we have a company here in town called Process Bolt. They basically automate filling out the spreadsheet over and over again, and they're selling it like hotcakes. Yeah. So yeah, what you described makes sense.
Yeah, because the process is simple, but it's the human error that creeps in over time, and the risk of that.
And one error is huge.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and if you do get to the point of you to look at capital, Radian Capital Partners in New York, this kind of stuff is particularly interesting to them. They're a growth fund, so they're gonna be, when you hit like 3 to 5 million ARR, they want to just like dump
push
the fuel on it.
I would love to shoot you a deck through just to get you a little bit more understanding of what exactly we're doing.
Please.
And there's also one last thing. I won't take time here, but we are kind of like one of the scopes was to get in touch with the regulatory bodies, so EMEA, TGA, etc. TGA, we are in talks. So we've got into the CSR, like CCR, Critical Supply Chain Consortium, which includes all of them.
Mhm.
The process of getting into reg in different environments, even having a conversation with FDA, very complicated, I understand, but have you seen that happen? Have you seen those conversations happen? Have you seen similar?
Yeah, yes, like I mean, it's complicated, it's slow, like regulation, right, it's science-based, but it's also people, it's conservative, right? So the adoption of something new, it like you just got to beat your head against it for longer than you probably want to. But if you do, the upside is your competitor probably isn't going to want to do that, or they're going to have to spend 2 years doing it and you're already ahead of them. But yeah, I don't know that there is really like a good way around it because it is just complex and conservative.
Thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Vinesh. Any final questions before? Because Frank, once we have someone wonderful, we don't let you go very easily.
No worries.
Any questions before we let Frank enjoy his dinner, because it's now 7:30 p.m. where he is. If not, as Vinesh says, yes, we love good brains. Are you happy for people to reach out and connect with you on LinkedIn? I've just put you on the spot, so you can't really say no.
Yeah, no, please do. I mean,